We're delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India. It is our pleasure to present today 10 Flashpoints, Manish Tewari in conversation with Milan Vaishnav. Member of Parliament, author and lawyer, Manish Tewari's recent book, 10 Flashpoints, 20 Years, is an insightful examination of the challenges that have characterized Indian foreign policy over the past 2 decades. In conversation with the Senior Fellow and Director of the South Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Milan Vaishnav, Tewari discusses reform, re-evaluation, and the way forward to meet the demands of the 21st century's regional and global security environment. Manish Tewari. Manish Tewari served as the Union Minister of State, Independent Charge in the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Government of India, and was the spokesperson of the Cabinet and the United Progressive Alliance government. He is currently the senior national spokesperson of the Indian National Congress. Tewari was also a distinguished senior fellow at the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank. He is currently serving as the Standing Committee of Finance and Joint Committee of Parliament, examining the Data Protection Bill, as well as the Parliamentary Consultative Committee of Defense. He has authored 4 books, Decoding a Decade, The Politics of Policy Making, Fables of Fractured Times, Tidings of Troubled Times, and 10 Flashpoints, 20 Years, National Security Situations that Impacted India. Milan Vaishnav. Milan Vaishnav is a Senior Fellow and Director of the South Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His primary research focuses on the political economy of India. Vaishnav is the author of When Crime Pays, Money and Muscle in Indian Politics. Feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comments section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag @Jaipurlitfest. Ladies and gentlemen, 10 Flashpoints. Manish Tewari in conversation with Milan Vaishnav. Over to you, Milan.
So, Manish, I want to ask you a little bit about the origins of the book to start with. You say at the very beginning that the book is neither a practitioner's account nor an insider's tale, but an observer's reflection. And so you're trying to reach a wider audience with this book, not just the kind of expert foreign policy wonk. But I found something you said immediately after this very interesting, which is that part of this book is really aimed at your colleagues in Parliament, as well as your colleagues at the state level. And here you say there is virtually no serious debate or informed introspection of our national security calculus, even within the rarefied echelons of the legislature. And I'm wondering if we could start there and tell us a bit about how national security policy is discussed or not discussed in the corridors of Parliament.
Well, thank you very much, Milan, and thank you for doing this conversation. You're absolutely correct. The reason why I caveated the book by saying that this is neither a practitioner's account and nor is it an insider's tale, primarily because I wanted to step back and really have a holistic look at events as they evolved over the past 2 decades and see from the public record as to how really did those choices that we made in terms of the flashpoints we confronted, how securer have they left India 20 years down the line? And the reason why I also made the second statement in the introduction is, in my experience in the legislature, I find that there is a strange reluctance on the part of government. And when I talk about government, I talk about government generically going across administrations to really have an informed discussion about critical national security issues. So while in the standing committees of, let's say, external affairs or defense or the Ministry of Home, there might be a discussion on certain issues, but many areas are literally no-go areas. And the classical example of that is that we've had the standoff with China. Now going back to April 2020, it's been close to 21 months. And there has not been a single discussion in Parliament. And unfortunately, Parliament seems to have been dumbed down to people articulating very constituency level issues, issues which are really in the domain of municipal bodies and state legislatures, rather than being a deliberative forum or a policy forum for some of the very critical challenges that India confronts. And since national security is essentially intertwined with a large number of issues, even economic issues, this desegregation or this dehyphenation which has taken place, whereby anything which pertains to national security is treated like a holy cow and is to be brushed under the carpet. That seems to have become the norm rather than the exception. Coupled with that, what I found is that, given the humdrum and the daily grind of having to service large constituencies with demographics over 22 million people. For example, if you look at my parliamentary constituency, which is essentially a rural constituency, Sri Anandpur Sahib in Punjab, we have 1,500 villages and close to 15 urban agglomerations. So therefore, with sizes as large as that, and hardly any expert support, people completely and absolutely get deflected from their primary role, which is as national legislatures to really look at national policy.
Your book looks at 10 national security flashpoints over a 2-decade period, from the Pokhran tests to 2611 to Doklam. And I think rather than asking about each of these one by one, I'd love to hear you reflect on some of the lessons learned. Because these are lessons that should be learned not just by the political class, but also by the so-called Aam Aadmi, right? The common man and common woman of the country. I want to start by asking you about a perennial hot button issue, which is India-Pakistan relations. You note that, look, India's rise is largely dependent on a peaceful and stable neighborhood in South Asia. And we know that key to this, of course, is some kind of compromise between India and Pakistan. But your book demonstrates across a series of flashpoints that time and time again, India has extended the olive branch to Pakistan. Those efforts have been undermined by the military intelligence establishment or by proxies who work under their supervision. So I guess my question to you is this: in the current scenario, and we're recording this in February 2022, is there any real scope for a kind of rapprochement with Pakistan, given the nature of the civil-military balance there?
Well, Milan, that's a tough one, and I'll try and answer it as succinctly and as candidly as possible. One of the things, and this is going back to your earlier observation, that are there any lessons learned? And I don't think there are any lessons learned, because at the end of the book, when I reflect upon these 10 flashpoints holistically, the conclusion that I draw is that if we were confronted with similar situations again, we would actually end up walking down the same road or the same path. And this is something which is unfortunate, because it obviously goes to show that there are a very limited with very limited learnings which have been internalized. Or if at all there are institutional learnings, they do not actually find very, very substantive reflection. So unfortunately, the answer to that is a big no. I don't think that we have evolved the institutional capacity. Now, the classical example of that is if you look at one of the flashpoints that I discussed and which feeds into your second question. We got surprised in Kargil. We got surprised again in the April of 2020 when the Chinese transgressions happened. Essentially, if you look at the nature of both the transgressions, the nature is quite similar. So therefore, you have mountainous terrain and you have irregulars in the case of Pakistan, or what they claim to be irregulars, and regulars in the case of China, the PLA, which came in and transgressed on what is not only perceived, but is Indian territory. And this is not the first time it has happened. If you rewind back all the way to 1947, we got surprised in 1947 when the aggression in Jammu and Kashmir, again, by what was then termed as Pathan irregulars took place. We were partly surprised in 65 also. We were similarly surprised in 1962. In fact, if you read Ambassador Nirupma Rao's very, very exhaustive account of those years between 1947 and 1962, it comes out fairly evidently that the Indian government or the Indian state was belaboring under this illusion that the Chinese would never attack us. And that turned out to be completely fallacious. So therefore, under those circumstances, despite a Kargil review committee, despite a group of ministers, then 10 years down the line, the Naresh Chandra committee looking at it. And of course, these reports are either not in the public domain, or if they are so heavily redacted. Unlike the 9/11 Commission, where the report was put out without any redactions in the public space, there seems to be that paranoia, if I can use that particular phrase, that if we were to discuss everything openly, perhaps there would be a political cost to it. I mean, for reasons which are quite unfathomable, cannot really understand why the Henderson-Brooks report continues to be classified, despite the fact that we would be in the 60th year, or we are in the 60th year already, of the Sino-Indian conflict in 1962. Insofar as Pakistan is concerned, we are really tied down by the baggage of history. What really is the narrative between India and Pakistan? Partition, 4 wars, allegations of cross-border terror by India, which are substantive. Similar allegations by Pakistan, which at least to my mind do not seem to be all that substantive. And so therefore, there are no positive building blocks between these two countries, and it becomes very easy for any semi-state actor, non-state actor, or a vested interest to derail whatever incremental progress may or may not have been made. In fact, when I used to serve as a distinguished senior fellow with the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., one of the things that we tried to do in conjunction with the IISS, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, was to actually find the building blocks of trying to build a new narrative between these two countries, a narrative which can surmount the corrosive and completely negative state of play, which has now existed for 70 years. The silver lining which I see to this is that the ceasefire which was announced in the February of 2020 still continues to hold. So therefore, there is hope. So if both countries were to persevere and try and find a modus vivendi, I don't think it is really in the realm of impossibility. But the India-Pakistan dynamic is also hostage to domestic politics in both the countries. And it would really require an act of faith on behalf of the establishment in Pakistan and the government of India to really, first of all, internally decide that the destiny of both these countries lies in a peaceful South Asia, and then to walk that talk. And I don't find that kind of conviction in either of the establishments for reasons which we can go into at some length. And number two, most importantly, given the completely toxic narrative, it becomes very easy for anybody, for that matter, even the great Indian media, to derail whatever incremental progress is there.
So there are domestic drivers of this stalemate between India and Pakistan. There are also external drivers. One might say that one of those external drivers is Pakistan's alliance with China. There's an old saying in India that India should strive to have better relations with both the United States and China than those two countries have with one another. Given the events along the line of actual control, that aspiration seems to have been dealt a body blow. It doesn't seem that either the government or public opinion in India would allow for stronger relations with China or warmer relations with China, at least at this point in time. But I guess this leads me to a follow-up to what you just said, which is if you go back to the '62 war and the aftermath, you see that a number of our present security institutions, whether it was border security forces, whether it was the intelligence apparatus, whether it was all kinds of military units, they derive their origins from the aftermath of '62. Do you see the government reflecting on recent events with China along the border and kicking into a new gear about trying to gear up for the current China challenge?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question. Now, if you were to rewind back again to 1962, and herein lies the paradox. And the paradox is that '62 happened primarily because the Soviets did not want to break with the Chinese in the larger universe of the Communist International, primarily because the Cuban Missile Crisis was playing itself out concurrently. And so therefore, in a certain sense of the word, the Soviet Union almost winked and nudged and looked the other way, while the Chinese decided to go in. And it was actually the United States of America which came to India's aid at that point in time. Nehru's letters to then President, if I remember correctly, President Kennedy, were emphatic about asking for American help. But then 21st November, the Chinese decided to go back. And within a span of 9 years, we seem to have come a full circle, whereby we had a treaty of peace and friendship with the Soviet Union. And when the Bangladesh war happened, which was India's finest strategic moment that we redrew the map of South Asia, you had a situation whereby the Americans were arrayed on the adversarial side. And that, to me, represents a quintessential paradox that in a span of 9 years, which as you possibly understand it better than anybody else, is not really a very long period in international affairs. How did we actually perform a 360-degree somersault? And then interestingly, from 1975, when we had the last violent skirmish on the Sino-Indian border, things remained peaceful till Galwan happened in the June of 2020. So the takeaway for me is that going across different dispensations and different administrations, we were able to finish the China dynamic, fairly well. But I guess everything changed with the Xi presidency. It inaugurated a completely new state of play insofar as how China would really like to settle things on its periphery. And coupled with that, I guess a lot of the belligerence which happened in April 2020, not only Quay India, but the announcement of administrative districts in the South China Sea, the move that they made on the sovereignty of Hong Kong, was also a kind of a lashback by China because of the negative publicity which they received in their attempts to try and conceal the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've really entered into a completely new era, uncharted waters. And I think India would really have to go back to the drawing board and reassess its strategy, not only as to how it needs to deal with China, but more importantly, how it needs to actually deal with all those countries in China's periphery who, similarly like India, have been at the receiving end of Chinese belligerence, whether because of the 9- or the 7- line in the South China Sea, or because of the other territorial claims they have. So in many senses of the word, this transgression by China opens up a vista of opportunities for India. And if we are innovative in our thinking, if we are prepared to think out of the box, I think the present situation presents us with a lot of opportunity, provided we are nimble and we are skillful as to how do we really utilize this opportunity.
The current tensions with China lead me to ask you a little bit about the US-India relationship. And you note in the book, and I want to quote here, that the Indo-US relationship remains a strategic planner's best bet to counter China's increasing influence in the Indo-Pacific, end quote. There have been, I would say, a rising number of commentaries coming out of India that are not so sure about that claim. They see the volatility in America. They see, quite frankly, the democratic backsliding. They see the inward turn politically and economically. And they worry that, maybe the United States is not as reliable a partner as it once was. And I would love your take on this. How would you respond to people who articulate this view?
Well, all those concerns, Milan, are absolutely legitimate. And the reasons why those concerns are legitimate is primarily because the US is exhausted after two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, both unfortunately, which have not gone very well for the United States, to put it rather mildly. In fact, the Iraq intervention has spun off a dynamic in the greater Middle East, which even the US now finds it difficult to deal with. Afghanistan, unfortunately, went belly up. And there is this whole concern with regard to the budget deficits which have been which have ballooned as a consequence of these interventions, and and I think that's part of the impetus why the US has turned inwards. But having said that, the reason why I say that it remains a strategic planner's best bet is primarily because the US, with all the reservations that it may have or all the constraints that it is under, still continues to be the single most powerful outside balancer in almost every region of the world. And given the hub and spoke alliances which the US has, from Japan all the way down to Australia, I do not think that any dispensation in the United States of America would really be able to unwind all that, because it in fact then would represent a complete reversal of the architecture which the US has so assiduously constructed over the past 7 decades. So under those circumstances, given that the power differential between India and China today is 5:1 in favor of China, but the power differential between the US and China still leans heavily towards the United States of America. It, to my mind, remains our best, not only our best bet, but possibly our best partnership in order to try and circumscribe, if not proscribe, the very belligerent behavior which we have seen with the inauguration of the Xi presidency.
I can't resist but ask you, Manish, about your chapter on the US-India civil nuclear deal, because you really take us inside the debate within the UPA-1 government, where, as some of our viewers may recall, in July of 2008, Dr. Manmohan Singh risked his entire government on the passage of that deal. You had a ringside view, and I'm wondering if you could reflect on why it is you think that Dr. Singh rolled the dice in the way that he did, and do you think that historians will credit him for putting US-India relations on a new plane?
Well, definitely the Indo-US Civil Nuclear Agreement was the high water point in the Indo-US relationship. And one of the regrets that I personally have is that ultimately it never got operationalized because of the entire liability issue, which to my mind could have been much better handled rather than split the liability between the operator and the supplier, which essentially then meant that the whole thing went completely belly up. But if you step back from the nuts and bolts of the Indo-US civil nuclear engagement, the fact that it broke India's nuclear apartheid, allowed India to become a respectable partner in many of the international regimes which had been put in place to proscribe India's nuclear program going all the way back to 1974, I think was Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh's single biggest achievement. It's unfortunate that Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh has not written at length or spoken at length about the imperatives which necessitated him to put his government online. But I have alluded to it somewhere in the book that possibly, given the fact that when he was serving in the Ministry of Finance, he was simultaneously also the member finance in the Atomic Energy Commission, it kind of gave him a bird's eye view or an understanding of the constraints which India's nuclear program was under. And therefore, he possibly made it his life's mission to be able to surmount that. And if you look at it after that high water point, Indo-US relations have been stable. And in fact, they've been able to take the setback of the Indo-US civil nuclear agreement not getting operationalized in its stride. And then you've had these foundational agreements which were signed. So in many senses of the word, Dr. Manmohan Singh actually broke with two intrinsic or anachronistic status quos in the entire Indian governance ethos. The first was when he reoriented India's economic policy in 1991 as finance minister, and then as prime minister, when he actually reoriented India's foreign policy. So therefore, conceptually, if you look at it, the two most salient turns which India took in 1991 and then again in 2005, when the discussions between India and the United States on the nuclear deal started, both actually go into Dr. Manmohan Singh's kitty.
I want to ask you a little bit more about the United States, particularly about recent events. You know, the U.S. exit from Afghanistan, its precipitous exit, was not exactly cheered on by those of you in India and in the power corridors of Delhi. And there's now, of course, a security vacuum on India's doorstep in some ways. Some analysts have said that the Modi government's decision to unilaterally abrogate Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir back in August of 2019 was in some sense prescient because it established new facts on the ground in advance of the US exit and the potential redirection of proxy forces who may be focused on the West to the East and the J&K Valley. And I'm wondering if you buy into that India's regional security posture has actually been enhanced, has been improved by the fateful decision of August 2019 to nullify 370.
Well, first of all, on Afghanistan, I think India should have been cognizant about the fact that this was something which was coming. For some of us who had the occasion to come and go from Washington, D.C., especially between 2012 to 2020, could very easily grasp, even in the policy space, that the United States was absolutely exhausted. They were looking for an exit, right? And Ambassador Khalilzad's remit was fairly clear that he had to find a modus vivendi to ensure that that exit takes place. Now, unfortunately, the best laid plans of men and mice do not pan out in the way that you want them to pan out. And Afghanistan, I think, is that classical example. But to say that it caught us by surprise, I think this means that we didn't have our ear to the ground. I mean, as someone who's worked in Washington, D.C., you are fairly cognizant with the fact that going back almost to the time when the Obama presidency was inaugurated, it was quite clear when the Bruce Riddle review takes place that the U.S. dispensation was uncomfortable about how things were playing itself out in Afghanistan. So therefore, between 2009 and 2021, I mean, if you couldn't figure it out, then possibly it's a failure of diplomacy. Number two, about Article 370. I think the jury's out on that. As someone who led the debate in Parliament from the opposition benches, opposing the abrogation of Article 370 and the dismemberment of Jammu and Kashmir, and someone who continues to be a counsel in that matter in the Supreme Court of India, I find the manner in which it was done to be extremely problematic. But if you were to set the legal aspects of it aside and purely look at it from a strategic point of view, I think we've actually created a problem for ourselves, which may not be visible at this point in time. But if it does erupt, it may explode like a volcano. Because eventually, your only insulation against the depredations of a hostile power which uses semi-state actors or non-state actors, you can pick the terminology you like, is your own internal social cohesion. The reason why we succeeded in defeating these forces in Punjab between 1983 and 1995 was because whatever they tried, they could not break the social cohesion of Punjab. Unfortunately, the abrogation of Article 370 and the dismemberment of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and this is the first time that a state has been downgraded to two union territories, I think has further fractured and ruptured that internal cohesion. And I just hope that things do not come to a pass where we have to confront the unfortunate situation that manifested itself in 1989 and 1990 in Jammu and Kashmir.
Manish, before we wrap up, I want to ask you to reflect a little bit on the future. At the very end of the book, you have this really interesting line about what India's posture should be going forward. And I just want to read it out. You say that the twin challenge for India is to craft its own template of Jacksonian exceptionalism in external engagement that gives both space for consolidation and strategic autonomy, and yet is not an act of Jeffersonian isolationism. So for those not familiar with the American analogies, unpack that for us, if you would. What is the big takeaway, you think, in terms of how India should position itself in a very, very complicated global order?
Well, Milan, India needs 3 decades of peace on its periphery. It needs space for consolidation in order to surmount its internal developmental challenges and its internal security challenges. So therefore, if you have an unsettled periphery, you are not able to concentrate on some of the fundamental human developmental challenges that India continues to face. Number 2, if you look at the threat profile of India, it does not match up to our defense expenditure. You have to either bring down the threat profile or you have to ramp up your defense expenditure exponentially. Now, if you were to ramp up your defense expenditure, you are obviously taking away from other priorities. So therefore, you have to craft a policy which is based on realism and which goes back to your first question about Pakistan. We need to find a modus vivendi with both Pakistan and China. Therefore, till the time we do not find that modus vivendi, unfortunately, we are going to be stuck in a zero-sum game. India has not been able to break out of its neighborhood. I mean, it may have great power aspirations, but the reality is that an unsettled periphery with China and the legacy of partition with Pakistan continue to hobble us. And we have to shed this baggage of history and see if we can find a modus vivendi. And so therefore, our engagement with the world has to be based upon our own terms and a certain degree of exceptionalism, whereby we remain cognizant and we remain grounded in reality that we need these 30 years, which China, or which Deng Xiaoping gave China from 1979 all the way up to 2012, in fact, more than 3 decades, which allowed China to create that power differential with us. And so therefore, till the time we do not start measuring up, not matchstick to matchstick, but at least in terms of substantive capacity, this propensity to punch above our weight may land us in a problem which may be extremely unfortunate. So that's the analogy to Jeffersonianism and the rest of it, which is there in the book.
10 Flashpoints, 20 years, national security situations that impacted India is the name of the new book. Manish Tewari, thank you for joining me. Thank you for this conversation. And I wish that in the future, some of these conversations may be held on the floor of Parliament, because I do think they're extremely important and timely and matter for the nation and for the public. So I think this book, in many ways, is a public service to illuminate some of these issues. Again, not for necessarily the soldier who knows this very well, or the hardened diplomat who has been implicated in many of these cases, but really for the broader public. So congratulations, and lovely to have this conversation with you.
Thank you very much, Milan. And as a sign off, it's extremely unfortunate. 43 questions of mine from the September of 2020 till now, with regard to the border situation with China, have been refused, citing grounds of national security. And so therefore, I don't think it behoves a mature democracy to really get so paranoid about something which is discussed every day in the public space, but we are unwilling to discuss that in a structured format in Parliament. And that's why one of my endeavors has been to see if I can make my own colleagues in Parliament and in the legislatures cognizant about some of the critical challenges that we face, so that there could be more traction for some of these discussions.
Well, as they say, from your lips to God's ears, great to chat with you, Manish.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Manish and Milan, for that truly fascinating conversation. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us a series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. Hope to see you in the next session.